The best way to play PlayStation 2 games might not be on original hardware anymore. PCSX2, the veteran PS2 emulator project, turns 20 years old this year, and they have some massive updates coming that are starting to make it so that the emulator has the potential to be a better experience than original hardware. Not something I ever expected to say. The PlayStation 2 is by far my favorite game console of all time. It had a cool design, awesome marketing, a stellar controller, and the games were just so cool. It had an enormous library, to the extent that even regular players of the era still haven't heard of all of the games. And the console hardware was produced for 12 years, wrapping up in 2012 after 144 million units had been shipped. And it had releases for the system into 2014, being serviced by Sony Japan until 2018. It was just marvelous. But it wasn't without its faults. It had noisy video output hardware, and the graphics tech led to most games relying on field rendering rather than frames, meaning that most games ran in 480i interlaced mode, and getting a smooth 60 FPS out of them on the TV side for modern TVs wasn't easy, but it had a lot going for it. The console supported optical surround sound audio, composite, S-video, RGB, and component cables for video, with the component cables being able to output 480p progressive scan on some games and 720p or 1080i on a couple of games, and networking and an internal hard drive via expansion card. It was also the first console to have USB ports, even if limited to USB 1 speeds, and was a stellar DVD player, much more affordable than many at the time of release. It was a beast. The PS2 is my preferred console to collect for, but as the hardware ages and games become more and more inaccessible thanks to rapidly escalating greed in the collectible scene the past few years, emulators are the next best way to play older games, and the PlayStation 2 emulator PCSX2 is making strides towards perfection. I thought it was compelling to take a renewed look at the emulator before the launch of Sony's new game streaming option for PS2 releases, as it seems like Sony haven't quite put in much effort towards improving the experience. PCSX2 is top tier. It is impressive just how long the project has been in development and how well performing it kind of always was. I remember playing PS2 games on my crappy laptops in high school with it. Not big gaming laptops or anything, and it's only gotten better from there. PCSX2 is free and open source and uses a combination of MIPS CPU interpreters, recompilers, and virtual machines to manage the hardware virtualization and run games on your computer. Over 98% of the official PS2 library is now considered playable, with many of them in a perfect state, and that last less than 2% at least boots into the game. This is a massive achievement for any emulator, especially one with as colossal of a library as the PlayStation 2 has. Using the PS2 emulator is pretty straightforward. Download the latest release for your operating system, though I will say at the moment many of the upcoming changes are still only in the dev nightly builds, so it's worth trying those instead. I've been running one of the AVX2 dev builds and have had no stability issues, but your mileage may vary. After you extract it with a program like 7-Zip, you'll need two more things in order to play your games: a BIOS file and a game. The BIOS file is basically the software that the PlayStation itself runs to boot and load your games. This has not been reverse engineered yet and would be a massive copyright violation to provide directly, so this has to be sourced elsewhere. I have a companion video up on Nebula discussing how to source BIOS files in games if you want to learn more. Games can either be loaded from discs themselves or ISOs. You can boot games directly from the DVD in your disk drive, just like a real console, but this is significantly slower than booting from the ISO running off of your local hard drive or SSD. An ISO is just a virtualized image, a digital copy, if you will, of the physical disk. Thankfully, it's free and quick to make your own ISOs from games using a program like ImageBurn. Tutorial on that is in the aforementioned Nebula video if you need it. From there, open PCSX2, choose Boot Game, and pick your game. Point the program to your BIOS file, and you can start playing. You will probably want a controller too. You can map controls to mouse and keyboard, but PS2 games were not really built for that, and you'll have a far better time using a gamepad. Thankfully, the emulator supports any controller under the sun, from Nintendo to Xbox to PlayStation to PS2 controllers with USB adapters to random other input devices. Most mainstream controllers should be recognized automatically, or you can go to Config, Gamepad settings, and map the buttons to your liking. This also means you're not stuck with the default controls in any particular game either. Naturally, PCSX2 supports multiple gamepads for split-screen games, so you can map extra controllers here as well. With the dev builds, and once these updates are fully released, most of the settings don't even need to be messed with. Any tweaks or fixes are going to be applied automatically, and for a great, accurate PS2 gaming experience, you're set. But you can go in and bump up the visual quality a bit. You don't want to do this for every game, and we'll talk about how different games play with this in the time-coded section later, but under Config, General, and then GS Window settings, you can set games to run at 16:9 if you want them to run in widescreen instead of native 4:3. Most games have working widescreen hacks built into the emulator, and it works fine with this. Then you can go to Config Graphics to add things like anisotropic texture filtering to make textures smoothen out better, to increase the internal rendering up to 8x for an 8K render of the game, which is absolutely bonkers, and other visual tweaks. You can also change the renderer from DirectX to software or Vulkan or Metal if you're on Mac. AMD GPU users might find that Vulkan works better for them, though on my RTX 3080 system, I found while the Vulkan renderer performed great and fine for most games, some did run better in DirectX 11 or 12 mode. Though when trying to push games to 8K with my Titan RTX, the Vulkan renderer actually won out there. If you're chasing down specific quirks in how a game is presenting, you may end up having to try OpenGL or software mode too. Updates-wise, the emulator now has 6 different renderers they're supporting: OpenGL, DirectX 11, software mode, Vulkan, Metal for macOS, and a merge was just made for DirectX 12 support too. This means that a high-performing compatible option should be available for just about any modern machine on any operating system. They're also moving it entirely to 64-bit, which does cut off update support for super old systems, but the 64-bit version already had more optimizations and was faster for the software renderer anyway. I also thought it was neat that they've been working on supporting modern instruction sets. Previously, PCSX2 just required SSE4, but they now have dev builds testing AVX2, which all modern PCs support, and just means more speed and more power available to you. The team has been hard at work merging all previous hacky tools into the core emulator itself. So plugins are no longer a thing, they're just all part of the core now. Hardware and game-specific hacks now just get automatically applied to provide the best and most accurate experience. Most controllers will just be automatically supported without manual mapping as well. Playing PS2 games with a DualSense controller is wild. Support for online-only titles have been added, disc and HDD support have been added for Mac, and they've been working on emulating more niche accessories such as the iToy camera, USB microphones, and so on. Accuracy and performance in general is of course always being worked on. The team is even working on improving the PS1 mode to play PS1 games via the PlayStation 2's backwards compatibility. I'm not sure this will ever, fully supplant a dedicated original PlayStation emulator like DuckStation, but it's awesome regardless. Also, the recent changes for portability and code unification help bolster the development of Aether SX2 and Android PSX2 port. Wild stuff. Pretty much everything covered in this video was tested using the nightly dev builds of the emulator, but they're rapidly approaching a full new stable release with all of these features plus new ones being added every day every time I check the merges. The full release might be up by time this video goes live, and if not, it'll be shortly thereafter. There's a lot of videos out there with the best settings for PCSX2, which is understandable given it's a big search term, and don't be surprised if I release my own standalone video on it soon, but they're all pretty contradictory and not necessarily helpful anymore. Thankfully, with the updates I mentioned, most of these best setting videos showing the user checking a bunch of hack boxes and tweaking speeds, none of that is necessary now, and in fact, most of it isn't even recommended anymore. The default settings are great. If you want to play PS2 games as they natively run as accurate as possible, literally change nothing. If you want minor tweaks, go to Config, GS Window, and change the view to widescreen. And then you can go to Config Graphics and change the internal render resolution to really start cranking things up. However, this is something you'll probably have to balance on a per game basis if you want to go beyond, say, 720p. Let's talk about how it plays in some games. Most of the videos that go up about emulator updates and progress each year tend to focus on the perfect examples, cherry-picking scenarios where things run amazingly or look better with increased settings, and that kind of skews what the real experience is. I don't want to lie to you, but at the same time, there is some pretty amazing stuff here. I will say though, if you're fine to just run games at native PS2 resolution, perhaps in widescreen, without messing with the internal render resolution or anything, you'll have a very high performing experience and things should run smoothly for that full 98% of playable games that was mentioned. If you're curious how a specific game plays or what known issues the game still has, look it up on their wiki. It's pretty detailed, although I've consistently found a specific issue I have to not be reported on most games, which I will discuss in a bit. Some games you'll probably want to keep at native res. Changing things up breaks the experience or sometimes makes things look worse. This comes down to some of the traits I mentioned before. Games are built around field rendering and often went with blurrier textures to provide a more photorealistic feeling that doesn't scale well when you start cranking up the render resolution, and some effects just seem to break the experience, on top of being built to leverage the way CRT displays look anyway. A big example of this for me is Midnight Club 3. Trying to run at an increased render resolution just makes the game look awful, in my opinion, and isn't a good time. But running it at native res, while obviously more overall blurry on my higher res LCD display, it looks like it should. It's a PS2 game that runs at 480i. The big thing to keep in mind with emulators is the way games were designed to look, and to not expect them to magically look like next-gen games. They just won't. Second wave 3D graphics do not scale quite as magically as pixel art games do. Leaving Midnight Club 3 at native res, it plays like a breeze and looks exactly how you'd expect an early 2000s car game to look and feel. Awesome. If you're curious what games you should check out on the PlayStation 2 to put this emulator to the test, check out my companion video on my Lost Saves gaming channel, where I and a bunch of other gaming creators give you those exact details. Soul Calibur 3 is a peek at what could be possible once some game-specific fixes make their way to it. If you crank up the internal render resolution, the character models and some of the geometry for the maps look downright incredible. Seriously impressive, but we get some weird issues. By default, if you crank up the res, you get a ton of ghosting, and applying a hack to fix that results in some wild screen tearing all over the place, neither of which are a very enjoyable experience. Bummer. Thankfully again, native PS2 res works just fine. Mortal Kombat Armageddon is another game that looks absolutely stellar in higher resolutions. This was a scenario where trying to render it at 5K, double the resolution of my 1440p monitor, did not run super stable using Vulkan, but DirectX 11 ran it great with only occasional frame drops. I could push it to 8K, but had a little too many hangups for it to be a smooth playing experience. By the way, you can change all of these graphics settings on the fly and immediately see the results without relaunching the game, which is awesome. Realistically, for most hardware configs, even high-end ones, I'm playing on an Intel Core i9-12900 and an RTX 3080 GPU. 4K is the more realistic upper ceiling for a flawless 60 FPS experience, but it certainly depends on the game. With my Threadripper and Titan RTX system, I can kind of hit 8K in some more games, but not all of them. Crash Bandicoot: The Wrath of Cortex is another game that relies mostly on 3D assets and minimalist textures and thus looks perfect upscaled, as does Digimon Rumble Arena 2. These kinds of games soar with higher render resolutions compared to more photorealistic games. Tomb Raider Anniversary is another game that just plays and looks brilliantly in PCSX2. God of War and God of War 2 are interesting games to look at. I'm using the sequel here. The game supports both widescreen and progressive scan modes, which you do still need to manually enable in games that support them for the proper experience, by the way, even with widescreen set in the config earlier. So you get a clean 16:9 image with progressive scan. It, for the most part, upscales very cleanly and runs at a silky smooth 60 FPS. But this is a game which immediately fixes a problem with running it on native hardware: screen tearing. For some weird reason, the PlayStation 2 God of War titles run with an obnoxious screen tearing during so many scenes throughout the game, especially during big combat moments, and I always found it to be pretty distracting, even on a CRT. This was fixed in the PlayStation 3 HD collection, but it always annoyed me back where my saves are on the PS2. This is a complete non-issue in PCSX2, so you get a better presentation than any of the official ways of playing these games. Awesome. It's also neat comparing the emulated version versus the PlayStation 2 upscaled to 4K using the RetroTink 5X's experimental firmware, which lets you scale games to 4K 30. This is unsupported and won't be compatible with all displays, but it works wonderfully on my LG CX OLED if you can tolerate 30 FPS. While there are plenty of games that look just fine with the hardware upscaler and original hardware, these newer 3D games with higher quality assets and effects actually look significantly better through the emulator. I ran into this when attempting AI upscaling on God of War footage using Topaz Labs Video Enhance AI too, but the PS2's noisy output results in Kratos looking super pixelated when upscaled from original hardware and just looks bad for what is actually a very detailed, great-looking 3D model. Rendering and outputting with higher resolutions in PCSX2 makes these assets shine by comparison. This is one kind of game where you get a real benefit from the added image quality and more pixels, but more photorealistic games like Midnight Club do not. Seeing Burnout 3 in full 60 FPS smoothness is so great. Despite what internet edgelords may tell you, there is no world in which older video games all ran at a locked 60 FPS, especially once we hit the 3D era, so getting higher performance through emulation is pretty awesome. Battlefield 2 Modern Combat seems to be broken in all renderers except software mode, and that seems to not run very well either. Yikes. Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2 highlights a specific issue that still affects many games: lines drawn throughout text frames, with the text blocks not lining up properly and some weird lines in FMV cutscenes or images. This is something described in posts as screen tearing, but it's vertical, not horizontal. With Ultimate Alliance 2, I could not find a complete fix. Reducing the game to native resolution fixed most of the issues, but cutscenes still stuttered and had weird lines in them. This affected Samurai Warriors 2 as well, with any text elements being messed up. These kinds of things don't affect gameplay, but help remind you that you're not quite getting the same experience as real hardware yet, but I feel very confident that they will be fixed before too long. Guitar Hero 3 ran pretty well at 4K, and trying out a PS2 guitar hooked up with a cheap USB adapter, the whammy bar wouldn't be detected, but otherwise it calibrated in the emulator with a 0 latency offset needed, which means that it is lag-free. Playback is fine, but some crowd members were displaying corrupted in DirectX 12 mode, but you can play it. Granted, my fingers don't move like they used to, but that's not the emulator's fault. An interesting game to look at is Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance. This is a game that already looks absolutely incredible on both PlayStation 2 and original Xbox hardware, with brilliant particle effects, water physics, solid character models, wonderful music, and they even use super sampling to render from a higher resolution for sharper graphics. It's using the same engine as the Champions of Norrath games set in the EverQuest universe instead of D&D, and I would happily keep buying more games made in this engine today. The game already looks stellar on original hardware, with the 480i restriction and noisy video output of the console being the main detriments here. Also, the game just got a PC port on Steam recently, with ultra-wide support and a couple minor port-focused tweaks, and upon digging into the files, it was clear to me that they just used the Xbox port to base this on, as there were so many files from the Xbox disc itself here. Putting these versions side by side along with the PCSX2 emulated copy with a higher output res reveals some interesting results. I'd say the PC copy is probably still the best of the bunch, though with tweaks, the PCSX2 version is nearly perfect as well. I'd say if you're going to upscale the game for just a little bit of higher fidelity to the character models, aim for 720p or 1080p. Once you go beyond that, you get some weird separation in the characters' mouths and such, which starts to look funky and is typically masked by the lower resolution of the original. Unfortunately, no copy fixes the broken audio compression that is used throughout the Xbox, the PS2, and now the PC versions.
They're becoming more bold with each passing day.
Finally, Gran Turismo 4 is a game I could not wait to test. And not only is it a legendary title in its own right, even though I'm horrible at racing sims and never got super into it myself, but the racing mode supports both 480p and freaking 1080i video output on native hardware. This has a benefit in the emulator too, as you're feeding it higher resolution data to then work with for the render boost. 1080i, which is basically 540p split up into field rendering, turns into a crazy 7680 by 4608 resolution output, and it is breathtaking. This looks like a PS3 or an Xbox 360 game, not a PS2 game. The only problem here is that the motion gets very blurry. This is due to the deinterlacing. With GT4, you have to choose between higher detailed images with blurry motion or less detailed images with more clear and smooth motion reproduction. This is a frustrating compromise, and one that affects many games, at least in terms of blurry motion output, and is only a choice that you have to make because PCSX2 only supports bob and weave deinterlacing models. These are fast and easy, but as I've discussed in much of my retro upscaler hardware coverage, are not very desirable looking. You might not think that this matters for a source that's rendering digitally versus an actual analog video signal. And yes, you avoid some of the annoyances like the bouncing up and down from bob deinterlacing as seen with the Retro 2X Pro and things like that here But it does still affect the image, since many PS2 games were designed to render games in those fields, with many of the games rendering in 30 or 60 fields per second instead of whole frames. The relationship between the final image and the deinterlacing algorithm is very important, especially when pushing higher internal and output resolutions. It's not as big of a deal for native res playback, but it will only become more obvious the more internal and output upscaling you do. I would love if the PCSX2 devs could manage to implement the motion adaptive deinterlacing as seen in the RetroTink 5X, FrameMeister, and GBSC AIO scalers, or maybe even QT-GMC that's taken off in popularity for VHS capture. But the last update I could find in the forums suggests that it's just not a priority for them right now. Quickly comparing the 8K output displayed at 1440p and 4K of Gran Turismo 4 running with higher res rendering versus original hardware upscaled to 4K with the RetroTink, it's a much closer match than expected. Aliasing and noisy textures put original hardware behind the emulated copy, but if it weren't for that, original hardware would still be my preference here. If you enable the on-screen display to show stats for game performance, you can actually see when a game is using field rendering versus frame rendering, by the way. Also, the license demos for GT4 are completely broken in PCSX2 right now, so shouts out to one of my editors, Wyatt, for getting me some race replays that I could replay on emulator and hardware for these comparisons, because I am useless at this game. Virtually every game will output 60 FPS in PCSX2, with the variety of 60 FPS patches now being baked into the updated versions. But the OSD will also tell you when a game is actually targeting 30 instead of 60. This leads me into other features I want for PCSX2, and honestly, there isn't much. Deinterlacing was the big one, but I also think there's a massive need for a per game config profile. The devs have responded in forums suggesting that this is silly and unnecessary, but given how frequently I was changing render resolutions, render engines even, and other settings just to get the best results in different games, if this is truly going to be an easy just play experience, the ability to save and tie config presets into specific games by the user is an absolute must, IMO. There was a launcher at some point that combined this with another feature I want, which is a games library feature, but as is often the case with open source projects, it was deemed undesirable since it was from outside developers, and it couldn't keep up with the core updates to the emulator itself and has been abandoned from what I can tell. Given you can't reasonably assign ISO files to just open in the emulator if you use them for anything else, it's kind of a bummer to not be able to choose your games from a nice library view, like with Steam, the Dolphin emulator, or even the OPL from my soft-modded PS2 menus. By the way, get subscribed to the Lost Saves channel because I have a video coming soon on the easiest way to soft-mod your own PlayStation 2 to play games from a hard drive, easier than 99% of the methods shown in other videos online. I would love for some sort of hack to be made so that you don't have to manually toggle the 480p and widescreen modes in games that, support it, since it is still necessary to change the rendered aspect ratio of the assets in the game. Lastly, I really feel like a memory card manager would be a nice little bonus at some point. PCSX2 has amazing memory card support with the ability to choose where they go, manually name the memory card files, and hot swap between them. You can have it auto-connect and disconnect the cards at certain points to avoid corruption, and you can even download memory card packs online to complete save files and, cheat your way through your games if that's what you're into. Having effectively an unlimited storage virtual memory card option is amazeballs. But beyond that, there's no easy way to just know what's on a memory card. So if you leave it on the default settings or you don't take verbose notes yourself, there's no easy way to see and discover which save files are on which memory card file, and that has already turned into a major headache for me again. You can convert the memory card file into a folder containing all of the individual saves as separate files, but I don't find it reasonable to have to do that every time, rather than just having a list view or something. Now you can choose no disk in the ISO select menu and browse the files like you could on a normal PS2 without a disk in. Maybe that should be good enough. Maybe. It is worth noting though that you can actually create a memory card folder to act as your folder instead of a normal file. It's even marked as recommended in the settings, but this is not the default behavior. I'm not sure if there's any disadvantages to doing it this way. I think all this comes down to just wanting a more polished user experience flow. Right now, if you launch it for the first time, you aren't really given any clue or an easy way to just play games, unlike, other emulators. So I understand why new users get frustrated. But I think the upcoming release having all of the hacks and quality fixes applied automatically is a huge step in that direction. And I hope over the next couple of years they can just shift a little focus over to UX as well. I know they've said repeatedly that their sole focus is on perfecting the emulation and getting all the games fully functional over anything else. These things matter too. If If you're curious how to acquire BIOS files, games, how to rip your own games, manage things like that, those aren't topics I can easily talk about on YouTube. So if you're interested in learning more, that will be in the companion video uploaded on my own video streaming site, Nebula. Nebula is the video streaming site I built with my creator friends. My videos are higher quality there, ad-free, and I've been trying to give a lot more companion videos like this one that gives you extra content, as well as some of my exclusive content series up there, like my Maker series Crafting Bench, and we have some tutorial series for DaVinci Resolve and OBS coming soon. Good stuff over there. And if PlayStation 2's library is insane, nearly 4,000 games, but many of them were Japanese only. I have this lovely blue Japanese PlayStation 2, but not everyone can afford that luxury. PCSX2 lets you play games from other regions, which is awesome, especially since there's a ton of good fighters and shmups that never made it to the States. Another epic feature coming to PCSX2 is the ability to dump and load textures. This means that you could theoretically source higher res texture packs for just about any game and further improve on the visual fidelity or presentation. There are a tiny handful of these already available. These will mostly be done using AI upscaling tools such as Topaz Labs, Gigapixel, or Waifu2X. We'll be taking a look at this process and the pros and cons and the results in a future video, so get subscribed for that. But in some cases, running games at native render resolution with upscaled textures can look a little bit better than running it in higher res modes with the original textures. Wild. The big downside here comes from the way that textures are stored in PS2 games. You have to load them in the game in order for them to be dumped, which means you're effectively playing through an entire game to get a complete dump of textures. Ouch. PCSX2 now has shader support built in. Under Config, Graphics, and then the Shader tab, you can enable FXAA, anti-aliasing, control brightness, contrast and saturation, add external GLSL shaders such as from ShaderToy if you can get someone to convert them for you, or choose from one of the built-in TV shader options. I found the TV shader options to not be super amazing, and they're super basic overlays. At a distance, most of them are barely visible in the first place unless scaling down a capture where they get, emphasized, but I did like the diagonal and triangular ones the best. I tried one of the .fx shader downloads in the forums, but I think they just kind of moved towards wanting that functionality built directly into the core itself, and all I got was broken lighting from using them. Alternatively, since the emulator now supports DirectX 11 and Vulkan renderers, you can utilize ReShade with it. ReShade is an injection tool to add additional post-processing effects to your games. Cool depth of field effects, color and contrast tweaks, additional, anti-aliasing or ambient occlusion, or crazy shader effects. I must admit, I don't have a ton of experience with ReShade overall, but you can really go crazy tweaking your PS2 games to look exactly how you want here. And there's been great strides in implementing various CRT emulation shaders, including the one from RetroArch, into ReShade, so you can go for a classic CRT look for your gameplay. Speaking of which, I've mentioned a couple times now that so many PS2 games have their visuals built around CRT displays to sell the effects. Naturally, you can play on one with PCSX2. You can either just set it to native PS2 render res and set your PC CRT monitor to 640x480 and have a mostly natural PS2 experience, or you can still render at a higher internal res and display back at 480p on the CRT for a kind of best of both worlds setup. Higher resolution models, but most of the textures and such will be unaffected. This look really works in my opinion. I dig it. Since PC monitors and their deinterlaced outputs don't perfectly match how the PS2 might look on a normal consumer CRT TV set, you could also pop on some of those ReShade filters to truly make it look old school, but that's likely too distracting for regular play. I will say that playing on my big 21-inch CRT monitor at my desk absolutely feels better for a lot of games than at 1440p on my LCD right next to it. It's really neat that they're trying to get PS1 emulation working just to be feature complete for the console, but it needs some work to say the least. Just stick with DuckStation for now, though definitely keep an eye on the project. I have to admit, I'm a play on real hardware kind of guy. I like my CRTs, I have at least 4 PlayStation 2 consoles, I'm still hoping to get my hands on a backwards compatible PS3, and while my collection isn't the most impressive on YouTube by a long shot, it's my favorite, my biggest, and my most personal collection, with so many of the games being true childhood keepsakes and not just adult pickups. But PCSX2 puts up a real competition and breathes new life into this glorious games library. I'm still waiting on the PS2 HDMI from Dan Koons, where we're hopefully getting a fix for the noisy video output for the first time, and hopefully motion adaptive deinterlacing like they added to the Nintendo 64 digital. But in the meantime, there's a gamut of reasons to play some games on the emulator instead, even if you're squishing it back down to 480p. The cool thing is, you don't necessarily need a super powerful computer to run the emulator. While they are removing 32-bit support and cutting off super old PCs, this really doesn't affect 99% of users today anyway. Unlike the PlayStation 3 emulator, PCSX2, where even just running the games can take a fair bit of horsepower, I was running PCSX2 on laptops in the early 2010s with iGPUs and nothing fancy. You can run it. Whether you can push games to 1440p or 4K or beyond is another question, but nearly everyone can play games with at least native performance, if not higher, which is amazing. This point is proven further by the Aether SX2 project, porting it to freaking Android. While it's great news that Sony is putting more PlayStation 2 games on their new consoles with the upcoming PlayStation Plus updates, it doesn't seem like your previous digital PS2 game purchases will transfer over, and there's a little confidence in how they will treat the user experience with the emulation. Huge kudos to the PCSX2 team for sticking with it for 20 years thus far and making a truly incredible experience. I have my complaints and my desires for features and polish, but it's quite the achievement that they have basically the entire library at least working, and I can't wait to see what the next few years look like. Links to everything mentioned are down below, along with links where you can sign up and watch the Nebula exclusive video on acquiring and managing BIOS and game files, as well as my video on lost saves, focusing on some of the best games to play in PCSX2. I'm EposVox. Remember, be kind, rewind.